Thank you all for coming tonight. I am Robert Wright, visiting professor of science and religion here at Union Theological Seminary, and as some of you know, this is the fourth of 5 talks in which I am laying out my version of a worldview that qualifies for the term spiritual, but is compatible with science and even grounded in science. The final talk is Thursday night, 2 nights from now. So tonight I'm going to start with a video that I think is a pretty exotic piece of video in a certain sense. You okay? Okay. This is a video of me interviewing an evolutionary biologist about 25 years ago. And it has never been shown publicly before. At the time we shot it, I had hoped that we would eventually turn it into a documentary, or in my wilder dreams, a PBS series, but unfortunately the seed money that we got to start the project was the last money we ever got. Okay. So this is, the biologist I'm interviewing here is William Hamilton, very influential and well-known biologist. He actually passed away about 10 years after I shot the video, which was, I think he passed away in early 2001. He is known for, among other things, coming up with the formal theory of inclusive fitness, also known as kin selection, which explains how altruism evolved in families. At the beginning of Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, there are 4 biologists listed whose pioneering ideas Dawkins says the book is based on. One of them is Hamilton. I think a lot of people would say that Hamilton is one of the, if you had to list the great biologists of the 20th century, I think a lot of people would list Hamilton. Very, very important figure. And what happened here is I was interviewing him, and we were talking about what you'd expect, and then the conversation took kind of an unexpected turn. Now, the video starts, the first sentence is a little clipped. So what he's saying is, on the other hand, I'm also quite open to the view, and then he goes from there. So let's...
I'm also quite open to the view that there is some kind of ultimate good which is of a religious nature, that we just have to look beyond what the evolutionary theory tells us and accept promptings of what ultimate good is coming from some other source. I could enlarge on that in terms of the possible existence of extraterrestrial manipulators who interfere and so on, but I think this would be getting too far from the general topic of discussion.
Okay, but are you referring partly to the prospect of a transcendental purpose to which we are oblivious as well?
Yes. There's one theory of the universe that I rather like. I accept it in an almost joking spirit, and that is that planet Earth in our solar system is a kind of zoo for extraterrestrial beings who dwell out there somewhere, and this is the best thing that the most interesting experiment they could set up the evolution on planet Earth going in such a way that it would produce these really interesting characters, humans who go around doing things. And they watch their experiment interfering hardly at all, so that almost everything we do comes out according to the laws of nature. But every now and then they see something which doesn't look quite right. This zoo is going to kill itself off if they let you do this or that. So they insert a finger and just change some little thing. And maybe those are the miracles which the religious people like to so emphasize. I think it's... I put it forward in an almost joking spirit, but I think it's a kind of hypothesis that's very, very hard to dismiss. I mean, if I were setting up an aquarium or something, this is virtually the way I would do it. I'd try to make as interesting an aquarium as I could, and I'd try to make sure that this big fish didn't molest this little fish too much, and I'd occasionally insert a finger and try to stop him, and And how could we actually prove that that wasn't happening in some of these alleged miracles that go on in our world?
Okay, so there you go. Any questions? So I think there are a few takeaways from this. First of all, to talk about the possibility of higher purpose, there is in some sense a higher purpose, is not necessarily to say that there's a God that provided the purpose, right? It could turn out that we are just in a zoo, and that's our purpose, and extraterrestrials imbued our system with purpose. That's one possibility. And in fact, as I'll go on to explain, it needn't even be the case that the purpose be infused by an intelligent being. It's possible that a process can, in a certain sense, imbue a system with purpose. So when I say that tonight I'm going to argue that there is at least some evidence that evolution has in some sense a purpose, that there's some purpose unfolding through evolution, those of you who are religiously inclined maybe shouldn't get your hopes up too high. You can get them up medium high maybe, because it is true that kind of my take on the possible purpose, or my take on what evidence we have of what the purpose might be, is in some ways spiritually suggestive, I guess you could say. Okay, so a second takeaway here is that to talk about there being a larger purpose, a higher purpose, is not to say that there are spooky forces involved in evolution, right? I mean, in Hamilton's scenario, he's just talking about nuts and bolts natural selection, okay? And he just says maybe it was set up with the idea that it would lead to this intelligent species, but there are no immaterial forces involved. And in fact, even when he starts talking about, quote, miracles, once we have the human species and the aliens are messing around with things, presumably they're just using an advanced technology that might seem miraculous to us, but doesn't defy the laws of science. So to talk about evolution having a purpose does not necessarily mean that we're talking about anything other than natural selection. I think one reason people have the intuition that it does, I think there are various reasons that people kind of equate purpose with spooky forces. I think one is that one idea that's gotten a certain amount of attention is the so-called theory of intelligent design, or the intelligent design movement. And this comes from people who insist that natural selection is not capable of accounting fully for evolution. And they kind of imply that there's something going on, some sort of divine assistance being provided kind of in real time or something. But anyway, what I'm talking about is not that. It's not intelligent design. In fact, if you Google my name in intelligent design, what you'll probably find is a critique, I hope debunking, of intelligent design that I did about 15 years ago for Slate. There's a third takeaway here, which is that some biologists do see evolution as directional, in the sense that it was likely to lead in certain directions, in particular, likely to lead to more complex forms of life, and of special interest to an intelligent species such as ours, okay? Not all biologists would say that evolution was likely to do that, but a number would say intelligent life was a likely outcome, and Hamilton seems to be presupposing that here. The idea is that once these aliens set up natural selection, they were pretty sure that they'd get something somewhat like humans at least, okay? Now, to say that evolution has a direction is not the same as saying it has a purpose, okay? You can imagine that it so happens that it tends to produce this outcome, but that was not in any sense designed in. It's not here in order to do that. So direction and purpose are not necessarily the same thing. On the other hand, I think there is a common intuition that direction is suggestive of purpose, that if there is direction, that strengthens the argument for purpose, okay? I think that's kind of implied in what Hamilton is saying, but in any event, that is an intuition. And one thing I want to do tonight is kind of flesh that out and say it's more than just a vague intuition. It's actually the case that a certain kind of directionality would provide at least some evidence of a larger purpose that might be unfolding through evolution. And I think this is it's an underappreciated point, and in a way my main point is just we can have a rational discussion about the prospect of higher purpose, and there can be evidence you adduce and counter arguments you make and so on. Now the other thing I'm going to do tonight is trot out a kind of you might call a new theory of consciousness. I've never talked about this in public before, And perhaps after tonight, I never will again. But in any event, after we get through this evolution and purpose thing, I'm going to throw out a conjectural hypothesis about consciousness, if only for the sake of argument. Okay, so I talked about direction. That I said there's been a kind of directionality on this planet that is suggestive of purpose. So what do I mean by the direction? Let me show you. Start out with bare strands of self-replicating material. Something like this must have started natural selection. It encases itself in cells. I think that's a bacterium, but in any event, you get single-celled life. You get complex cells. They have like a nucleus that's in effect a brain. You get societies of cells, and then you get one-celled organisms. These are actually both cellular slime mold, which, as it happens, spends part of its life cycle in a social phase where the cells are disparate or spread out, they're diffuse, and then it comes together to form a fruiting body. And so that kind of illustrates, that at one point life, at some point this happened with life. Societies of cells came together to form organisms. So you've one-celled, multi-celled organisms, and then you've carried organization to a higher level, and then you get societies of multi-celled organisms. So you've carried organization to another level. Then you get, in one species, you get a brain that's so impressive that it can invent technologies. And at this point, you launch a whole new kind of evolution. Once you've got a pretty smart species, it's called cultural evolution. It involves the evolution of technology, of ideas, and so on. And then in our species, that has meant this cultural evolution has carried our social organization to higher and higher levels. So you start out with hunter-gatherer societies, then you get, Stonehenge is a chiefdom level society, which you get typically with agrarian, with some agriculture, multi-village polity, more complex than a hunter-gatherer village. You get ancient city-states, which actually looks kind of like a bacterium from a distance. You get, regional states, you get empires communicating with one another through trade routes, and eventually you get a kind of a socially, to some extent, an integrated globe that has led up to globalization. And this is, all of the colors indicate the density of devices connected to the internet. Okay, so red is a whole lot of them and so on. And this was like 7 years ago, so it would be redder and they would be more widely spread. But the point is, you get something that some people, I think, not implausibly call kind of a giant global brain, an interconnection of human brains into this thing that I think you could call a giant global brain. So organization has gone up to level after level, and here we are. That's an interesting direction to me, and that's what I'm talking about when I talk about the direction. And I argued at book length in my book Nonzero that this was actually all pretty likely when you look at it, natural selection. Well, it's likely to create an intelligent species, and the dynamics of cultural evolution were likely to carry us toward globalization. Okay, so now I'm asking, is there reason to think that this is a purposive process in any sense? Was this machinery of natural selection kind of set up to go all the way to giant global brain? And how would you even go about thinking about this question? Okay, how would you go about thinking about the question of whether a system is designed, has a purpose, okay? And perhaps ironically, I think part of the answer can be found in this book. Richard Dawkins is The Blind Watchmaker. I say ironically because he certainly doesn't believe evolution has a purpose. And as you see, the subtitle is Why the Evidence of Evolution Reveals a Universe Without Design. But I do think he does a good job in here of talking kind of clearly about the issue of how you think about designed versus not designed systems, and designed systems having purpose and non-designed systems not, and so on. So the title of his book, The Blind Watchmaker, comes from this treatise called Natural Theology by William Paley, a theologian. It was written a couple of hundred years ago. And Paley makes an argument for the existence of God, and it's this. He says, if you're walking across a field and you see a stone, there's no reason to think it has a purpose, right? No reason to think it's a product of design. Whereas if you're walking across a field and you see a pocket watch, well, then there's reason to think that it was designed. I mean, it seems to have this intricate functionality. It seems designed to do something. It's a reasonable inference that that had a designer. And then Paley says, well, what if you come across an animal, like a squirrel? Well, it's at least as intricate as a pocket watch, right? And it seems to be designed, in a sense, to do things, to eat, and so on. So that's there's a valid inference there that that had a designer, and Paley says, so the designer is God. Now, on that last point, needless to say, Richard Dawkins does not agree that the designer was God, but significantly, he agrees with Paley up to this point, okay? So here's what Dawkins writes about Paley. He had a proper reverence for the complexity of the living world, and he saw that it demands a very special kind of explanation. The only thing he got wrong, admittedly quite a big thing, is the explanation itself. So he saw that it demands a very special kind of explanation. So Dawkins is saying, yeah, you can look at anything in the world and inspect it and ask, does that demand a special kind of explanation? Or is it just like a rock? It just is. It's not designed to do anything. So we can, by inspecting any physical system, we can look for signs of design and designs of a purpose, okay? So, you know, look at a squirrel, it's hallmarks of design. You look at other physical systems and they're not. So, just to run through the logic, he's kind of the things he and Paley do and don't disagree on: rock, squirrel. The question is, do they need a special explanation? They both agree. The rock doesn't, the squirrel does. Here's where the disagreement sets in, is if you answer yes, you ask, well, what's the explanation? Is it a conscious designer or a process of, quote, design, i.e., in this case, natural selection? I put design in quotes just because some people complain if you use design to talk about natural selection. Some philosophers do. I mean, evolutionary biologists commonly say, maybe as a kind of shorthand, you know, teeth are designed to chew food and stuff like that. But some philosophers, there are different schools of thought. Some don't like you to use the word design unless there's a conscious, intelligent designer. So I just put it in quotes to acknowledge that, you know, it's in some sense different. But at the same time, both a process like natural selection and a conscious designer can imbue things with purpose, with goals, okay? And in general, in this talk, when I use the term design, I'm using it, you know, to refer, in the broad sense. It could refer to a conscious designer, it could refer to a process. Anyway, the question I'm asking, anybody guess what GGB stands for? The giant global brain. What about the giant global brain? Okay, is it possible that has hallmarks of purpose in much the way that a squirrel does? Okay, which category does it fall in? Is it like a rock or is it like a squirrel? I think it's in some ways like a squirrel, at least in enough ways to be interesting. Now, I mean, first, it has some functional properties at the kind of global level. Just as a squirrel's brain coordinates the squirrel's behavior, and Dawkins would say that's a hallmark of design. Well, the giant global brain does things like, you know, I don't know, you know, enforce or moderate the enforcement of international treaties or something, or orchestrate the manufacturing of a car where the parts are made in 12 different nations, they magically assemble in a factory, and you know, the giant global brain orchestrates behavior on an international scale, and in some ways that are kind of good for the whole system and so on. So there's that parallel. Now, some of you might ask, when I say I think the giant global brain needs a special explanation, what some people say is, what do you mean it needs a special explanation? We already know how it came to be. Natural selection created human beings. We understand that part. Human beings launched technological evolution. That led to the giant global brain. Where's the mystery? Where's the need for a special explanation? My reply is, okay, so when Dawkins says a squirrel needs a special explanation, he's not saying we don't understand how you got from squirrel egg to squirrel. The whole process of the creation of the squirrel is in fact understood, okay? It's a mechanistic process. That's not what he's saying needs explaining. In a way, what he's saying needs explaining is where did the DNA in the squirrel egg come from? Why is there this amazing algorithm that leads to the creation of a squirrel? He's saying you couldn't just say, well, it just happened. I mean, it's too complicated and interesting for that. The process of the squirrels unfolding into this functional thing is just not like a rock. So the question is, where did the algorithm in the DNA come from? Okay, he's saying you need some kind of special kind of process of design in some sense to explain something like that. And by the same token, the question I'm asking is, does what initiated evolution on this planet, you know, you could say that has turned out to, in some sense, be an algorithm for the construction of a giant global brain, right? The first self-replicating material on the planet led to the evolution of intelligent species, led to the giant global brain. You could say, well, maybe that's like an algorithm for the creation of giant global brain. So just to really try to drive this home. So squirrel DNA, through a process of ontogeny, embryogenesis, or maturation, you could call it, leads to a squirrel. We understand the process already, but it's kind of so amazing what comes out of it that we have reason to suspect there's design. And one reason is the directionality of the process. In other words, the DNA is likely to lead to a squirrel. Okay? That's one reason to think there's something going on here, that it's designed to do it. And I'm just saying, the first self-replicating material, it leads to this biological cultural coevolution process and leads to a giant global brain. And the giant global brain is interesting and functional. And I'm arguing that there is the kind of directionality to some extent that you see in the ontogeny with the squirrel, right? It was this process of coevolution was likely to lead to a giant global brain. Now that's the argument, okay? So I guess in a way, a shorter version is, you know, Dawkins says basically, when you see like a seed grow into a flower and see what the flower does, you see an egg grow into a squirrel, there's good reason to suspect there's purpose. What I'm saying, and design, what I'm saying is, if you saw in time lapse from the beginning of life on this planet to where we are now and saw these things unfold and information processing systems move to higher and higher levels until you have this global brain, you would go, whoa, that's like more like a flower blossoming than I had imagined. Okay, that's kind of in a way what I'm saying. Now, I was going to show you this video of an exchange I had with Dan Dennett a while ago. We were having audio problems with it beforehand, so I decided against it. We think maybe the audio problems are fixed, but I've decided to spare you of it anyway, and instead just use it to answer, I know the question on everyone's mind, what did I look like 15 years ago? That's younger is the answer. Younger. It's been directionality since then of a kind that I'm not entirely enthusiastic about. So, but what I do want to do, it was a kind of long video. You're better off without it probably. It's online if you want to find it. It's on meaningoflife.tv if you go to the origin section, because it appeared a long time ago on Meaning of Life TV. But I do want to take out there was a controversy around this that I want to talk about a little bit, okay? I got myself into hot water with this thing because after I put the video online, I wrote a little thing arguing that Dan Dennett, famous new atheist, had actually acknowledged that there was evidence of purpose in evolution. Then he got outraged and accused me of misrepresenting him, and there was all this turmoil. So I just want to show you the two things that the two parts of the exchange that had led me to think he was acknowledging this, okay? So this is me. I said at the very end, so I'm just saying that, it's kind of, not the most well-constructed sentence in the world. I said, I'm just saying to the extent that, I think we've agreed that observing, what is it, I guess, ontogeny is the term, the development of an organism, that it has its directional movement toward functionality by design, that we agree that about organisms. Dan and I agree that that's true of organisms, and that's in fact the hallmark of design. I said, would you agree that to the extent that evolution on this planet turned out to have comparable properties, that would work at least to some extent in favor of the hypothesis design, to some extent, to any extent? He hesitates, finally says yes, yes, he concedes the point. So the only way I could read that is that these comparable properties would have to refer to directional movement toward functionality. So I said, okay, he's conceded that this is a hallmark of design. And then we had this other exchange where he seemed to concede that that actually happens on this planet here. I'm saying, I've described, an organism unfolding. I say, I would submit that if you step back and observe life on this planet in time lapse, including not just the evolution of human beings, but the cultural, including technological evolution that led to where we are today, the process would look remarkably like that. And in fact, you yourself say in your most recent book, Freedom Evolves, you say, the planet is growing its own nervous system, us. And it's true, it looks like that. Then it says, yeah, absolutely. I say, and there's a functionality about it. And he says, yeah, yeah. So I thought he was acknowledging, directional, remember, the directional movement toward functionality and was the hallmark of design. We agreed on one hallmark, and I thought he was agreeing to it here. Anyway, so the first he hears of this thing I've written arguing that he had found evidence of, or acknowledged evidence of design and evolution, or purpose in evolution, was irate followers of his, saying, what have you done here? And so he immediately said, I didn't say that, I couldn't have said it. And there was an elaborate back and forth, and I won't take you through all the elements in it, but he wound up saying that quote in which, I said directional movement toward functionality, and he said yes. He wound up saying he hadn't meant by saying yes what I would think he meant. What he says he meant doesn't seem plausible to me, but whatever. He says he meant it. I guess it's up to him. If you want to know probably more than any of you want to know about this, my whole account of the back and forth is on nonzero.org/replytodennett.htm. But the thing about the controversy that was interesting to me was in part just the level of controversy. I guess this was maybe my first big internet controversy, and you know what that can feel like to be in the middle of that. But I kind of don't totally understand why it would have been such a scandal for him to be saying what I said he was saying. Because I said, look, he's not saying he believes there is purpose in evolution. There's any kind of purpose unfolding. He still believes that on balance, the evidence doesn't favor that. He's just acknowledging that there's a little bit of evidence now in favor of that hypothesis. He still doesn't buy the hypothesis. I was clear about that. But you would have thought I was accusing him of a capital crime. And, I know some people have compared the New Atheist to a religion in some ways. The New Atheist is term for Dennett and some other people. And it was as if he had been accused of heresy. But at the same time, you get a little of this beyond the New Atheist community. The fact is, it's among a lot of biologists, it's still kind of taboo to talk about the possibility that evolution has a purpose, even though you're talking about it in strictly material terms, about, a purpose unfolding through the workings of nature. Some philosophers are not enthusiastic about talking about it, and I just think it shouldn't be a taboo subject. We can argue about it rationally. And if you see that clip of me and Dennett, you'll see we have an extended exchange where we point, counterpoint. Now, in our subsequent email exchange during the controversy, in a charitable moment, he said to me, "You draw attention to an interesting avenue of argument that has not been particularly well explored so far as I know." Well, that's my point. It could use further exploration, and I think people are a little averse a little too averse to talking about it. Now, on this point that the new atheists shouldn't have been so freaked out about this. I would just reaffirm that even if you acknowledge the actual existence of purpose, which, Dennett didn't say he believes in purpose in the end, you're a long way from talking about God in the sense that we usually mean the term. So to make the point, here's that, again, the kind of sequence of questions you ask about systems. Even if you answer that, yes, the giant global brain looks as if it has a purpose, there's two kinds of answers. Conscious designer, as we've seen, that could be God, could be Hamilton's extraterrestrials, whatever. But there's also a possibility over here. CNS stands for cosmological natural selection. This refers to a kind of a theory from this very creative physicist named Lee Smolin. The idea here is that universes replicate themselves. So as with natural selection, over time, you get universes that are more and more conducive to replication. He says maybe that's why there's all these black holes, because those are portals of replication. And one of the variants of this cosmological natural selection is, involves the evolution of intelligent life. This is not the one that Lee himself has developed, but some people have developed this idea that, okay, maybe what happens is, in universes where life starts evolving, if it reaches a level beyond our own level of technological and scientific sophistication, you get to a point where the forms of life can actually engineer the replication of future universes. And what they would do in that case is, in creating the algorithm for the next universe, they would make sure they kept in this likelihood that it would give rise to life, okay? So this is a scenario where, again, it would be not a conscious being that imbued evolution with purpose, but a process very much analogous to natural selection, just by way of showing, again, the, how open-ended the thing is, even once you agree, if you agree, that there's evidence of purpose in evolution. Now, that said, I would be lying if I said I am not myself particularly interested in the spiritual side of this and in the question of whether, whatever is responsible for evolution might have some of the attributes that we associate with the word divine. Okay, that's a very interesting question to me. And last week when I spoke, I talked about the fact that there seems to have been a kind of a moral progress accompanying this expansion of social organization. And that in a way, I think that was kind of built into the system in a certain sense, or at least it was getting a big assist from the very dynamics of the expansion of social organization. So that's the kind of thing you could appeal to if you're going to argue that it isn't just a purpose, but it's not like a morally neutral purpose, right? It's a purpose headed somewhere in moral terms, which might be evidence that there's something divine behind it. Anyway, I'm very interested in that question, I acknowledge. Now this leads to my theory of consciousness, the moment you've all been waiting for. It's because it is related both to this moral progress, this kind of expansion of the moral circle, I guess you could say, and it's related to the question of whether this coevolutionary process, biological and then cultural evolution, has purpose in the first place. I mean, I'm basically arguing that if you think of consciousness having a particular, if the coevolutionary process has a purpose, that helps make sense of something that is otherwise mysterious about consciousness, okay? Now, by consciousness, I mean, subjective experience. The fact that it's like something to be alive is my rough and ready litmus test for consciousness. If I say, is it like something to be you? You say yes, then either you have consciousness or you're lying. Those are the only two possibilities, okay? It means you have subjective experience, you have feelings, you experience thoughts from the inside. Now, in preparation for explaining this thing, let me just run through the kind of three kind of views of consciousness that I think pretty much just about all philosophical views on consciousness fall into one of these categories. One, it doesn't exist. Believe it or not, this is actually it's called behaviorism in philosophy. And I actually think there are other schools of thought that actually implicitly boil down to the claim that consciousness doesn't exist. I actually think that's actually Dennett's view, although he doesn't say that. But I've noticed when you say that about him, he gets really upset. So I say it as often as possible. So I'm saying it now, okay? That's one possibility, which I don't think is a possibility. It certainly seems like it's something to be alive. Another possibility is that consciousness does not do anything, okay? This is called epiphenomenalism. Consciousness is just a so-called epiphenomenon. So, in other words, it is created by the brain, so the brain influences it, but it does not in turn exert any influence on the brain or the being that is conscious. So it's kind of like consciousness has a relationship to the brain that that steam has to a steam engine, okay? Steam engine produces the steam, but the steam doesn't come back and influence the workings of the steam engine. That's the epiphenomenal view of consciousness. So it's like, you know, it's like the relationship between my hand and its shadow is the relationship between the brain and subjective experience in this scenario. So to put a finer point on it, the idea is if you put your hand near a fire and you feel heat, and you retract your hand, in the epiphenomenal view of consciousness, although it seems to you like the feeling of heat led you to withdraw your hand, in the epiphenomenal view, that's not what's really going on, okay? All that happened is nerve endings send physical information to the muscles, physically compel them to retract. The feeling of heat was irrelevant to the reflexive pulling back of your hand. That's the epiphenomenal view. Third view, as you might guess, is consciousness does something, okay? An example of that is what's called interactive dualism, which means, okay, yeah, the brain influences consciousness, but sometimes consciousness, subjective experience, in turn influences the brain, the being. Now, I would say the second view, that consciousness doesn't do anything, is in a way the view favored within science right now. I mean, a lot of scientists don't talk explicitly about a theory of consciousness, but it seems kind of presumed by the way a lot of discussion of behavioral science happens, that a strictly physical, materialistic account of the organism would be a complete account for purposes of explaining behavior. And I think that's not an implausible view. I mean, science has been very successful in explaining behavior, looking at finer and finer levels of the organism and explaining behavior. Now, this does raise a question, though. If consciousness is epiphenomenal, like, what is it for, right? Why is it here if it doesn't do anything? Here's where I put it in my book, Three Scientists and Their Gods, which I published in 1988. Everything sensations might seem capable of accomplishing can also be accomplished through the movement of physical information. And then I went through and I described natural selection from a strictly physical, structural standpoint, and showed that, you know, that's really all you need to explain natural selection. And then after I did this describing of it, I wrote, most evolutionary biologists would endorse this description as a generally accurate description of how we came to be. Such endorsement amounts to implicit agreement that there is no obvious reason for any of us to be conscious. The phenomenon of subjective experience is evolutionarily superfluous. And those are the two sentences I underscore, you know, everything sensations can accomplish, you know, in the epiphenomenal view can be accomplished by physical information. So the phenomenon of subjective experience would seem evolutionarily superfluous. Now, I do think this has come to be more and more a kind of accepted view. The landmark work in this realm is this book, The Conscious Mind, by David Chalmers. It was published in 1996. What I had called the superfluousness of consciousness, he called the extraness of consciousness. And but he went well beyond that. I mean, he did do a good kind of, you know, comprehensive argument that it's kind of a mystery why consciousness exists if it's epiphenomenal. But he went further than that and talked about also the mystery of how consciousness would be generated. And just in general, he talked about what he calls the hard problem of consciousness and tried to really drive home to philosophers that we in a sense don't have a clue. There's just a lot of fundamental things about consciousness we don't understand. So he became justly famous for that. So now it's time for my theory. I think it's actually original. I had lunch with David Chalmers a few months ago, and I laid it out. He hadn't heard it before. He knows the territory better than I do. So I think, it turns out in the real world, nothing you think is original, but for the time being, I'm under the impression that this is original. And here's my claim. I'm going to argue that even if consciousness is epiphenomenal, okay, it could have a function. It could have a purpose. Now, if you've been paying attention, you should stop me right here and say this is crazy, right? Because what it means to say that consciousness is epiphenomenal is that it doesn't do anything, has no effect on the world. Well, how can something have a function, a purpose, if it has no effect on the world? Excellent question, and I'm glad you asked, because I have an answer. Okay, so it's true, it's not quite strictly speaking true that an epiphenomenal consciousness never, ever, ever has any influence on the world. Okay, it's true that in our distant ape ancestors a few million years ago, when they felt fire and withdrew their hand, the feeling of heat didn't do anything. Okay, that's true. However, our species has language, so we might not only retract our hand, but say, that felt hot. At that point, this consciousness, which had always been epiphenomenal, has influenced my brain and my behavior. It has led me to say that feels hot. And that in turn might induce other people to do things like say, oh, are you okay? And so on. So the fact is that even an epiphenomenal consciousness starts influencing the organism and the world once you have complex language and a reflective being. This part is not original to me. Others have noted this. What I'm saying is that this suggests a function that even this epiphenomenal consciousness could have. So, of course, the fact that it has an effect, the fact that it affects the world leads me to say I'm hot. That doesn't mean it has a function. I have to come up with some scenario, some plausible scenario about what the function could be. And this leads me back to William Hamilton's extraterrestrials. Those of you who have come in since I showed that video, the idea here is that there are extraterrestrials who set up natural selection on this planet, maybe invented the algorithm of natural selection to generate an intelligent species. Okay, now suppose that these extraterrestrials not only wanted to generate an intelligent species, but once this intelligent species, it has this social organization, these extraterrestrials want to sustain the expansion of social organization, okay? They want it to spread, hunter-gatherer, village, blah, blah, blah. You eventually get globalization, and you have cohesive social structures covering larger and larger swaths. So the question is, well, how would people talking about their feelings contribute to this expansion of social organization, right? That's what I have to argue if I'm going to argue that this kind of previously epiphenomenal consciousness actually has a function. And I think the answer is that, if you look at the expansion of social organization, it has involved moral discourse and the evolution of moral discourse, okay? I said, I think last week here that, we live in a world where a lot of people, I hope everyone here, have a cosmopolitan ethos. That is, they believe that people everywhere, regardless of race, creed, color, gender, and so on, deserve decent treatment, right? Even if they're half a world away and from a different tribe, we all at least pay lip service to the idea that they deserve decent treatment. And that helps congeal social organization. It reduces the amount of conflict. And believe me, it was not always the case. As I noted, last week, there was a time when members of one Greek city-state considered members of another Greek city-state literally subhuman, back when these city-states were fighting each other. So I think you can argue that moral discourse has played a role in the expansion of social organization, and it tends to involve the discussion of subjective states, right? It tends to involve people saying things like, well, wait, if we do this, then those people over there will suffer. And we've agreed that suffering is bad, right? Haven't we come to this agreement? So it's very hard to imagine what moral discourse would look like if there were not subjective experiences to refer to, right? So It seems plausible. I mean, this is obviously a crazy idea. I get that. But it seems plausible that, this is the function of an epiphenomenal consciousness. To put a finer point on the extraterrestrial scenario, so these extraterrestrials are going like, well, we would like, we want the social organization expanded, so we're going to need feelings, but we don't have any idea which species is going to want, which lineage will lead to the intelligent species, right? Because evolution is too contingent for that. It might not have been our lineage that became the first intelligent species. So we will just imbue consciousness in the fabric of organic life. All complex species will be sentient, they'll be conscious. Then whichever one becomes intelligent first will have consciousness, they'll have moral discourse. Giant global brain. Mission accomplished. So note that one virtue of this is it would explain why you get this weird thing of like latent influence. Okay, so in other words, in this scenario, consciousness, subjective experience, existed a long time before it did anything. Okay, it existed for hundreds of millions of years, presumably, before it actually ever did anything. And this kind of latent influence is actually characteristic of designed systems. So for example, human beings are designed by natural selection, and you have these kinds of latent functionalities. So like if you look at the reproductive equipment of, say, an infant, you'll go like, what is this for? It's not doing anything. You wait long enough, it does something. So latent functionality is a feature of designed systems. But I want to emphasize, this kind of consciousness could not have been designed by natural selection. Right? It's common to say, what is consciousness for? It must help the individual organism. Maybe it's designed by natural selection. That wouldn't make sense here. Natural selection would not spread a trait all across the animal kingdom before it's had any impact on anything. Natural selection only spreads functional traits that do things. That's why it spreads them. They have an impact on the world. That's why this would, and similarly, the level. It would not be designed for the benefit of the organism in this scenario, but rather for the benefit of the species. You might say the whole globe, since after all, the giant global brain does assume stewardship of the whole planet. Okay, so this theory is obviously conjectural. In fact, it's not really a theory, it's a conjecture, because it's very hard to test. On the other hand, that's true of theories of consciousness in general, to say nothing of questions of cosmic purpose. Those are also hard to test. But I do want to make a simple analytical point here, okay? Ironically, it is possible for epiphenomenal consciousness to have a function, a purpose, to be in some sense a product of design, but if so, the functionality lies at a level higher than the individual organism, and the being or process that designed it is at a higher level in some sense than natural selection. It presumably is the being or process that created natural selection. That's the scenario here. Okay, so I think that's a point worth making, at least in circles where they care about highly obscure points, maybe. But anyway, I think it's an analytical point worth making. And again, I emphasize being or process. We're not necessarily talking about a God or something that has the hallmarks of the divine. Now, Thursday, 2 nights from now when I talk, I will get more into the question of kind of, a little more into the question of like why you might attribute, well, if there is a designer, given what evidence we may have for that, why some of its attributes might qualify for the term design. I'll get into that. And I'll also get much more into the whole question of like what my spiritual worldview does for you in your lived life, which I haven't talked about at all tonight. This has been kind of philosophical and theoretical. I do want to close with one more point about why you might, about consciousness and why you might, another reason you might think that it's suggestive of something spiritual or divine. And my point is about the weirdness of consciousness generally. The point is, there's no way around how weird consciousness is. So let's just establish this by reviewing the 3 basic views on consciousness. First, it doesn't exist. Well, that would be weird because it sure feels like it exists, right? So we're done with that one. The third one, it does something, that's weird. That's a really fundamental challenge to certainly to the comprehensiveness of the scientific worldview, certainly. Because the idea here is that subjective experience, something in some sense immaterial, is influencing the physical world in ways that science can't really study, because science cannot see what's going inside it cannot see what my consciousness experience is like. It can see the manifestations maybe in the brain, but it can't see the other side of the mirror. So that's a serious challenge to science, and it's weird. Now, the second possibility, that the epiphenomenal one, that consciousness doesn't do anything, we now see that actually subdivides into two possibilities. One is that an epiphenomenal consciousness is actually functional, and you can see how weird that is, right? Because that does involve a thing that tons of people consider weird, that evolution has a purpose, imbued from, who knows where, and consciousness has this latent functionality. That's pretty weird. But also very weird is the idea, the view of epiphenomenal consciousness that doesn't involve function. In a way, that's the weirdest thing of all, okay? Now, here's what David Chalmers said in an interview in 1996 after his book came out. He said, with reference to this version of epiphenomenal consciousness, it seems God could have created the world physically exactly like this one, atom for atom, but with no consciousness at all, and it would have worked just as well. But our universe isn't like that. Our universe has consciousness. Apparently, God decided to do more work in order to put consciousness in. Now, I don't think Chalmers is religious. He's using God kind of metaphorically, the way Einstein was when he said God does not play dice, to mean his contention that there's not true randomness in the universe. But still, if you want to take the God thing a little more literally and get back into the realm of kind of divine-like designers, I would point out, and I made this point in my book, Three Sciences and the Gods, consciousness is what gives life meaning. Subjective experience, the fact that we have pleasures, pains, sorrows, we apprehend beauty, and that feels like something. All of this, I think we would say, is what makes life living and what makes moral discourse significant. If you heard about a planet on which there were these beings like us, but it didn't feel like anything to be them, right, at all, no conscious experience, no subjective experience, and then you heard that the planet had been blown up, I don't think you would mourn that for very long. It just would not be that big a deal, right? So consciousness is what gives life meaning, and as Chalmers says, on this very common view of consciousness, it's like we have no idea why it is. So you could posit that some sort of divine being threw consciousness in to give life meaning. That's one hypothesis. In any event, I would argue that evolution, in fact, has been a machine for generating meaning. By generating more and more biological complexity, it has generated richer and richer sentience, subjective experience, and thus has generated more meaning. So, just in closing, I would say, if anybody ever tells you that science is a truly comprehensive framework of knowledge, or tells you, as Richard Dawkins has suggested, that we don't need philosophers, I would just remind them that one of the things that science seems most incapable of explaining coherently is the thing that gives life meaning. Thank you. So I want to do a little Q&A and then give time for an exodus, and then I am willing to stick around later after a few questions from the audience at large. I want to say that Thursday we're going to, after my talk, that's 2 nights from now, as I said, that'll be a little less technical and theoretical than this, a little more, in a sense, spiritual, and a little more theological in a way, and a little more about what my spiritual worldview does for my lived life, and how it relates to the things spiritual worldviews have traditionally done, provide inspiration, consolation, hope, a sense of purpose, moral orientation, and so on. And then afterwards, there's going to be an actual reception with food and, I think, alcohol, right? Okay, so there's going to be food and alcohol. And then after a little milling around, I'm happy to sit down with anybody who wants to sit down and talk through things further. So that's Thursday, not to be too crass in my appeal, but free food and wine. Okay, so any questions? I'd imagine there might even be just sheerly like explanatory questions like, I don't get this part. Question there? Can you wait for the mic, actually?
The very last thing you said, that there appears to be a collection of meaning or complexity, and therefore that is what gives it meaning. Can you just elaborate on that? Because I feel like that's a little bit of a
Okay, I'm saying what gives life meaning, or at least it's a prerequisite for meaning. Maybe other things are required as well, but if it weren't like something to be us, if we were just literally robots, right, no internal life, we were just machines or zombies or whatever, no subjective experience, it's hard to say that our lives would have meaning, right? I mean, it would be like being a rock, in effect, right? You would just have no sensation. I mean, if I ask you what gives your life meaning, you'll start talking about things that give you feelings, right? The way my child makes me feel when they seem joyful, or the way beautiful art looks to me, meaning the way it feels to apprehend art, or the way I feel when I've helped some stranger in need, whatever you say when I ask what gives your life meaning is almost certainly going to appeal, certainly going to refer to some conscious state, subjective experience. So I'm saying, if it weren't for subjective experience, life would have no meaning, at least that's my claim. And then the rest of the argument is this: so far as we know, I think by far the most reasonable conjecture here is that sentience, subjective experience, consciousness tends to grow as organisms get more complex, right? I'm pretty sure it's like something to be my dog. I can't be sure. I'm pretty sure my experience is richer than my dog's. I also can't be sure. But that is a very common belief about evolution, that there's a correlation between kind of richness of consciousness and biological complexity, and it's just a fact, regardless of whether you think it was likely. I think it was likely, but it's a fact that evolution has created more and more complex, more and more intelligent beings over time. It doesn't mean all of them have gotten more complex, but if you ask at any given time, what's the most complex intelligent species on the planet right now? And if you go through, every 100 million years and check in, you'll find the answer is, basically the trend is higher and higher levels of intelligence and complexity. Presumably that's richer subjective experience, and I'm saying that equates with meaning. It's in that sense that evolution is a machine that generates meaning. It's a further question whether it's a machine for generating meaning. In other words, whether it was designed for that. Yeah. There's a mic. Sorry. Thank you.
My understanding of what you said for the second point on consciousness as an epiphenomenon.
Right.
That it has, by definition, then, no function. And then, more or less, what you're doing is you're collapsing that by saying that it does indeed perhaps have a function by facilitating moral discourse. So then it ceases to be an epiphenomenon.
You could put it that way. You could say that in the human species and the human species alone, epiphenomenal consciousness suddenly ceases to be epiphenomenal. You could put it that way if you want. But it's common to refer to this view of consciousness as epiphenomenal even when it's applied to humans. And then you have to point out, well, actually, it kind of has an effect when we talk about it. So that's a question of terminology. I mean, but yeah, so maybe a way to put it would be to say that in our species alone, epiphenomenal consciousness ceased to be epiphenomenal. And at that point, you can ask whether the effect it starts having is a functional effect. Why don't we go where you are there and then up here?
Yeah, for the purposeful epiphenomenon, do you have a conjecture as to whether consciousness is a fundamental sort of property of the universe, or is it, I know you used Hamilton's formulation, but I'm
well, there are different views on this. I mean, a view, one thing that's happened in philosophy is, as it's become clearer and clearer that we just don't have a clue about consciousness, is some theories that had seemed wild at one point are coming back into vogue, and one of them is so-called panpsychism. David Chalmers has been flirting with this. The idea there is that consciousness is not just a property of biological systems, it's a property of complex systems, period. And so even prebiotic complex, molecules or whatever, would have had some modicum of sentience in it. And so it's not just built into the fabric of organic life, it's built into the fabric of the universe. Even then, though, you would say that it's organic life, presumably, that carries sentience to really high levels. But last week we talked a little about Teilhard de Chardin, this theologian. His view was basically a panpsychic view. So that's one view. And then there's a view that, no, it's a property of organic life, and it's something about organic life and the physical constitution of life. And then there's a view that, no, actually it's a property of information processing systems more abstractly, whether or not they're carbon-based, as we are. So computers could, for all we know, have experience. And so these are some of the kinds of views you get of consciousness. Do you guys mind if I take a picture of the audience just for my scrapbook? Or whatever they call what do they call scrapbooks now? They call them Instagram, right? Or no, there's something else that's like a scrapbook. Okay, so thank you. I'll have you all sign release forms on the way out.
So this kind of fits in with panpsychism, but do you view artificial intelligence as a decoupling of consciousness and intelligence, and how does that fit into your theory of a directionality to evolution?
It's an interesting question. I mean, it gets back to the question of, is consciousness a property of information processing systems generically, as opposed to just carbon-based ones? But one thing about artificial intelligence is people keep conceiving it as something that would be in one machine or be in a robot, like in the movie AI, like to create an AI is to create these discrete robots. But when you think about it, the closest thing we have to artificial intelligence is like Siri, Google Now, I guess it's called, these or Alexa, the Amazon thing, where you ask it a question, and they're increasingly good at giving you the answer, and that's actually a very distributed system, okay? Your question is going up to the web is being scoured for the answer, and then the answer is coming back to you. So if there's consciousness associated with that, that's a very diffuse form of consciousness. And there is for all we know, there's a kind of collective consciousness at the level of the giant global brain, right? Or there will be someday, and that needn't necessarily preclude our feeling consciousness at an individual level, I think. But the thing about consciousness is it's always conjecture, because you can never be sure that any being but you is conscious. Okay, let's do these three in succession, and I'll write down the questions because I'm sure some people want to leave, and then after that, anybody who wants to hang around and ask questions can. So why don't you just ask your questions, and all three of you, and then I'll answer them.
The philosopher Jerry Fodor has some quote that's something along the lines of, if it's not literally true that my itching causes my scratching and my seeing causes me to say something, then everything I know is false and it's the end of the world. And I would hesitate that...
He's saying if it's not the case that the subjective experience is what causes?
It has a cause, yeah.
Okay,
so he's saying there's this moral horror to epiphenomenalism.
Okay.
And that should be in there somewhere if you're trying to build a theory that relies so much on morality to make its argument.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, going back to your issue of directionality, I mean, it seems to me that it wasn't inevitable that Homo sapiens would be here, that we would dominate.
Right.
I mean, we have Neanderthal genes in us, and there were so many archaic men and women who died out. There are so many dead ends. It's in a way, it's astonishing that we're here, given the ice ages and the climate that we had to deal with in Europe. It seems to me that, I mean, I do think evolution is random. I think it's astonishing that we're here. I do think we're threatening ourselves and our planet, and that we may not be here, and hopefully we will. But the idea that evolution is, progressing, you know, when you look at archaeological records, I don't know. I'd like to know your response to that.
And then,
since at the present moment it feels like such a moment in time that what happens now could determine, you know, the future for a long, long time. Do you think that right now that there may be more than one path in our evolution?
more than one possible future? Or are you talking about biological evolution?
Could we subdivide? Yeah, evolution.
Biological evolution.
Could we subdivide at this moment?
Oh,
or
in a different
jumping off
species
point?
or something?
More than one path of evolution. Is that possible?
Okay. Okay. So on the first point, the question of what are the moral implications of epiphenomenal consciousness, or how depressing would it be in a way? It's a strange thing to try to wrap your mind around. You know, it certainly suggests a determinism, right? It certainly suggests in a commonsensical way that there's no free will. I mean, we tend to think of free will as originating in consciousness or something. It doesn't have to mean that, I suppose. You can imagine. Anyway, that's what it seems like, and I'm sure that's one thing that bothers Fodor, is that the sense of control is illusory, right? The sense that you're in charge is illusory. Now, I guess there's two questions. As far as morality, does a deterministic view undermine the whole idea of moral culpability? You know, if there's no free will, can we be held responsible for our actions? My view is, you have to hold people, as a practical matter, you have to put people in jail if they kill people. At the same time, I've argued that in light of, well, kind of this consideration and some considerations from evolutionary psychology, we should never punish people strictly for retribution. There should always be a practical value, and that's the only valid rationale for punishment, even though our legal system still respects retribution as an option, or as a valid rationale for punishment. So on the question of kind of how depressed we should be, I guess it's funny. There are people, you see this among like very serious meditators, for example, who say that once they realize, you know, there's a doctrine in Buddhism called the not-self doctrine. It means a couple of different things. One thing it's taken to mean is that the whole feeling that the self, the you, is the CEO, it's really in charge of the system, that's actually an illusion, okay? That's one version of the not-self doctrine. There are very serious meditators who say they have found liberation in accepting that they have no control. And in effect, accepting, even though most people say Buddhism isn't technically deterministic, and basically surrendering to the idea that they're on autopilot. I know people. These tend to be people who've reached great meditative depths, and their state of consciousness is a little different from ours. But it happens. That said, I think most people find it depressing, like Jerry Fodor. But it's kind of a choice. I shouldn't say it's a choice. How you want to respond to the prospect of determinism, because if determinism is real, you don't have any choice. But anyway, my point is, different people have different takes on this. Does that go some direction toward addressing? Okay. On the question of, right, it was not inevitable that Homo sapiens would happen. The argument that intelligent life was likely is that it was likely that one lineage or another would. I mean, as it happens, we seem to have, after having the occasional sexual dalliance with Neanderthals, killed them off. Well, if they had killed us off instead, they probably would have evolved to our level. In fact, I think they had bigger brains than we did. So the argument is that it wasn't necessarily going to be primates or anything, but that if you look at the way evolution works, it's an incredibly inventive process. most like major things in evolution have been invented more than once. Multicellular life has been invented multiple times independently. Winged flight, multiple times independently. You know, different communicative systems. The very kind of eyeball we have, the kind of camera eye, been invented more than once independently. It's a very inventive process. We understand dynamics that lead to higher levels of intelligence in evolution. It's an observed fact that they've led to that in different lineages. I think it was a question of time before various things came together in one lineage or another, maybe including grasping appendages and a few other things. Anyway, that's the argument. Not that human life was inevitable, but that some pretty intelligent species was very likely given enough time. There's an analogous argument about cultural evolution. The argument that globalization was likely is that if you look at various thresholds that were critical in getting us to globalization, there's been a lot of multiple invention. Agriculture, invented independently many times. Systems of writing, different times. The New World had invented writing, including phonetic writing, in the New World, independent of the origin and so on. So the argument is that both of these processes, biological evolution and cultural evolution, are so robustly inventive that even if you kill off one lineage, you still get the progress. Given enough time and an auspicious environment, you get an intelligent species, and if it launches this cultural and technological evolution, eventually you get globalization. I don't think it's at all inevitable that globalization will manage to sustain itself, because once you get to the global level of social organization, for one thing, you've only got one experiment going. Used to be like one empire collapses, no problem, let the Chinese take over for a while, right? Let Chinese civilization. Roman Empire collapses, there's other civilizations, Roman, and eventually there's recovery. Now we've only got one experiment. And the other thing we don't have that is traditionally congealed social systems is an external enemy, like barring invaders from Mars. And traditionally external enemies have played a big role in keeping social systems together. So I don't think the outcome is at all inevitable. And this is actually part of the kind of cosmic narrative that informs my spiritual worldview, is that this is a critical moment in history. And if we don't make a kind of moral progress, we'll be in trouble. Critical moment leads to your question, because you use that phrase. What you said is it possible that like there could be I think there's certainly more than one path forward, in the sense that things could go horribly or well. That's two different paths. I think you're talking about the genetic future of our species. One thing I'd say is we're no longer talking about natural selection. I mean, if there's significant genetic change, we'll be talking about the manipulation, the intentional manipulation of the genome. And, that's a question partly of public policy. And, we're getting to the point. I mean, people are already exerting some influence. They're already like having selective abortions when they perceive certain, certain traits in the embryo. And that's tending to happen more among relatively affluent people than among poor people. And one choice is, it's a very hard technology to stop, right? It used to be in the old days, 100 years ago, eugenics, the idea of, in some sense, quote, improving the gene pool, or at least intentionally manipulating it, it had to happen in a centralized way. It would only happen if a government passed laws, which our government did, or some state governments at least did, and our Supreme Court validated, passed laws banning the reproduction of certain kinds of people. Now that it's increasingly going to be almost the opposite, that the intentional manipulation of the germline, so to speak, the genetic material, will happen unless it is outlawed. Because people who can afford it, or whose health insurance pays for it, or whatever, will do it, and some will choose to do it. And it'll go well beyond these selective abortions. It'll be like, like editing in, whatever, a better personality, or more, personality defined as better, brains, whatever. So it's partly a question of public policy. Is it legal? If it's legal, is it available equally to everyone, and so on? These are, big questions. I think right now, in a way, the more immediate question is just to keep the whole thing on track, keep us from like blowing up the world. But that's a big question. So that's it. So next, so 2 nights from now, I'll be back for the culminating talk. So thanks again for coming.